At exactly 2:07 p.m., the world changed, but not with an explosion, with a sentence. Inside the Situation Room, the red folder had already been opened. Trump's eyes were cold. His voice, colder. They crossed the line, he said, and without waiting for Congress, without briefing the Pentagon, he authorized the strike. One order, 3 warheads. Countdown. Active. Cameras didn't catch what happened next. But every journalist in that room remembers the sound of one chair moving, just one. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood up. No microphone, no raised voice, just a single sheet of paper in her hand. And then 13 words. The room froze. Phones dropped. A 4-star general blinked twice. The countdown paused. Because what she said wasn't protest. It wasn't politics. It was law. Law older than Trump, older than modern warfare itself. And in that moment, when the silence of war met the whisper of justice, something shifted. This story is a dramatization. The events are imagined, but the fear, real. The law she read exists, and the question she raised still echoes through every democracy. Who gets to declare war when the people aren't asked? If you've ever wondered whether one voice can stop a missile, keep watching. Because this time, the most powerful weapon in the room wasn't the red button. It was a whisper backed by truth. Isfahan slept soundly under a velvet sky, its domes and alleys wrapped in the kind of silence that only visits cities with deep history and tired children. No alarms, no warnings, just the soft hum of dreams. Then at exactly 2:13 a.m., the night split open. 3 explosions roared across the horizon like angry gods awakened from stone. The sky turned orange, then white, then black. A heat wave rippled through buildings like a silent scream. Windows shattered like crystal struck by fury. A mother on the 3rd floor dove across the hallway, grabbing her daughter just as the curtains caught fire. Down the block, a boy named Nami lost hold of his father's hand, just for a moment, as they ran. His father turned back to grab a wallet and never came out. The walls came down before the man could shout. Smoke filled the air. The stars vanished. From balconies, people cried out for names. Brothers, mothers, neighbors, only to hear static and fire. The city that never expected war was now living inside its heartbeat. Meanwhile, oceans away in Washington, a soft blue glow lit up a silent room. The president didn't call a press conference. He didn't gather Congress. He opened Twitter. With one flick of his thumb, he wrote, "They won't forget tonight," and hit send. No map, no justification, no allies informed. Just a tweet delivered like a missile, direct, unapologetic, and cold. In Capitol Hill, aides were waking up to chaos. But in the Bronx, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was already awake. Her desk lamp cast light on a worn black binder. Inside, the War Powers resolution, underlined, annotated, studied. Her phone buzzed. A message from her chief of staff. Confirmed. He ordered the strike. No vote, no briefing. She didn't respond. She turned a page. Because some wars begin with bombs, but others begin with silence. And if no one speaks, the silence wins. Outside, families were digging through rubble with bare hands. Somewhere, a child asked why grown-ups would drop fire from the sky. No one had the answer. But in a few hours, someone would, not by shouting, not by fighting, but by reading one sentence in one room with the world listening. This story is a dramatization, but the law she read is real. And the fear, that part we didn't have to make up. By sunrise, the Pentagon was in chaos. Generals arrived without ties, still buttoning their collars, eyes bloodshot and jaws clenched. There had been no military briefing, no coded red folder, no classified chain of command. Just a tweet, a digital flashbang that detonated trust before it dropped a single bomb. Intelligence officers scrambled to retroactively confirm what had already happened. Iran's military sites were smoldering, and they weren't even on alert when the missiles fell. Operation Night Hammer, the media called it, because someone in the West Wing leaked the name before they leaked the logic. Cable news exploded. One anchor called it a masterstroke of proactive defense. Another compared it to a rogue presidency dressed up in patriotic drag. The American public was stunned, not because of the strike, but because they'd found out the same way everyone else did, through a tweet in the middle of the night. Then came the moment that lit the fire. Trump walked into the White House briefing room not in crisis mode, but with swagger. Cameras snapped, reporters stood. His face beamed like a man accepting an award, not answering for an act of war. He approached the mic and smiled. "We prevented the next 9/11, he said, and we did it without hesitation. No proof, no intel report, just confidence, weaponized." Behind the cameras, staffers exchanged glances. They didn't know if the next question would be about legality or legacy. And in the Situation Room, where screens showed live feeds of protests erupting in Europe, his advisors were split. Some clapped quietly, others looked down. One aide muttered into their sleeve, "He just made himself judge, jury, and executioner again." Meanwhile, the world braced for retaliation. Iran's foreign ministry condemned the strike as an unprovoked act of terror. Allies hesitated. France called for restraint. Canada requested clarity. But it wasn't the world's confusion that mattered most. It was America's. Because for the first time in modern memory, the people weren't asking if war was coming. They were asking if they'd been tricked into it. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat alone in her office. The war powers binder still open, the news blaring from a muted screen, but her eyes weren't on the images. They were on the Constitution, highlighted, worn, annotated in blue ink and conviction. She whispered to herself, not in anger, but resolve. "This is not how our system works. This is not what we were promised." She wasn't just worried about the legality. She was worried about the precedent. Because if war could be started with a tweet, what else could be? Surveillance, detentions, domestic actions cloaked in crisis. The room was quiet, but her mind wasn't. She saw the coming headlines. She saw the strategy, but she also saw the fear in people's eyes. The kind of fear that doesn't come from bombs, but from feeling powerless. And that, she knew, was more dangerous than any missile. That night, while officials scrambled and pundits shouted, she drafted a single-page statement. Not with blame, but with one purpose: to ask the question no one else dared to put on record. Who gets to start a war in a democracy? And if the answer is whoever's holding the phone, then what is left of the people's voice? The tweet changed everything, not just for Iran, not just for Washington, but for anyone who ever believed that checks and balances were more than decoration. This wasn't just a foreign strike. It was a domestic alarm. And while others clung to slogans, she reached for statutes. The real fight hadn't even begun. In the vaulted chamber beneath Tehran's Ministry of Defense, fluorescent lights flickered like the breath of old ghosts. General Hatami entered first, flanked by two intelligence directors still smelling of ash and cordite. President Maskian followed, not with urgency, but with gravity. His suit was unbuttoned. His hands still bore dust from visiting the Isfahan blast site just hours earlier. The room did not need fire to feel tense. Screens on the walls displayed satellite images, 3 glowing red circles where Iran's nuclear research once stood. One facility was still burning. Another had gone silent. The third, the most advanced, the most secret, was simply gone. Among the dead was Dr. Farhad Amini, the country's leading physicist and the man many called Iran's Oppenheimer. He had stayed behind to protect backup data. He never left the compound. Around the table, ministers waited for Maskian to roar. But he didn't. He sat, clasped his hands, and said 7 words that echoed like iron. "Now we calculate, then we bite." His voice was quiet, but it chilled the blood. Because this wasn't about vengeance. It was about strategy, a cost-benefit equation written in fire and patience. Iran's streets were already boiling. Protesters waved burned flags, American and Israeli. Chants filled the air. But it wasn't chaos, it was clarity. For the first time in years, even Maskian's opponents whispered a single word: unity. The people weren't demanding retaliation. They were expecting something worse. And behind closed doors, that expectation became policy. Iran activated its cyber unit, blacklisted for years, but now reassembled under the codename Tidebreaker. Banks across Europe received silent digital probes. U.S. servers registered abnormal surges, brushed off as routine, but Tehran logged every second. Meanwhile, drones were repositioned in Syria. Submarines in the Persian Gulf shifted without notice. Nothing loud, nothing rash. Just the careful tension of a nation preparing a move that wouldn't be forgotten or forgiven. But Maskian's most dangerous weapon wasn't military, it was moral. That same afternoon, Iran filed a formal grievance at the UN Security Council. It wasn't just about the strike, it was about the process. A unilateral act of war, their statement read, executed through social media with no evidence, no oversight, and no regard for human cost. The world watched and didn't look away, because the U.S. hadn't just struck a facility, it had struck a precedent, and the silence from other world leaders was more telling than their words. Some feared the escalation, others feared the example, because if one leader could act alone, with no debate, no deliberation, and no consequence, what then remained of the system they all depended on? Back in Washington, AOC was already tracking every diplomatic move. She knew retaliation would come, but that wasn't the point. The point was, it didn't have to. The damage was already done, not just in blood or infrastructure, but in faith, in the belief that democracies don't act like empires. She wasn't waiting for missiles. She was preparing for a microphone. And when she stepped into the chamber, it wouldn't be to argue war. It would be to remind America what it promised to be. The cost Iran calculated was measured in lives, laws, and lines crossed. But as the world held its breath for the next move, one voice in Congress prepared not to retaliate, but to restore. Because this fight wasn't just geopolitical, it was constitutional. And while others planned strikes, she planned something far more disruptive: accountability. The air inside the NATO summit room was cold, not from temperature, but tension. Thick curtains blocked out the Belgian daylight as 29 leaders sat around an oval table, eyes heavy with expectation and dread. Then the door opened and Trump entered, not with a binder, but a black folder stamped with a red seal. He didn't sit. He walked straight to the center, placed the folder down, and flipped it open like a man revealing a royal flush. Satellite images spilled across the table, crisp, clear, marked in red. Natanz, Isfahan, Fordow. He didn't preface, he didn't ask, he pointed. We strike first, or we'll strike never. The words hung like smoke in a sealed room. Not a policy, not a question, a trigger. Heads turned. Some leaders shifted in their seats. Others glanced at aides who dared not speak. The Secretary General of NATO opened his mouth, closed it. No one voted. No consensus was called. Just silence, deeper than protocol, heavier than history, because everyone understood what wasn't being said. This wasn't a NATO strike. It was a Trump strike. And they were just there for the courtesy of watching the match being lit. A German diplomat whispered, "Is this legal?" A French official scribbled a note. Consequences? But Trump wasn't waiting for feedback. He was already dialing a secured phone handed to him by a Secret Service agent. No one knew who he was calling, only that when he ended the call, he nodded once and said, "You'll see it on the news." Then he left, just like that. No allies consulted, no Congress briefed, just a play made in the name of strength, in the absence of permission. What the cameras didn't catch was what followed. The rush of aides chasing clarification, the whispered demands for written directives, the legal teams texting in panic. But the strike, in truth, had already begun, not with missiles, but with that folder. Because what Trump brought to Brussels wasn't intelligence. It was irreversibility. And while the other leaders returned to their capitals, wondering if they had just witnessed a moment of defense or dictatorship, one woman in Washington sat alone, reading the War Powers Act again. AOC hadn't been in Brussels. She didn't need to be. Because power, real power, isn't always about who walks into the room. Sometimes it's about who asks the question no one else dares to ask once it's over. That question hadn't come yet, but it was forming. And when it arrived, it wouldn't be gentle. It would be a mirror facing the very system Americans swore was immune to kings. What happened in Brussels was no accident. It was blueprint, it was theater, it was warning. But most dangerously, it was precedent, and precedents, like sparks, don't burn alone. They wait for fuel, for silence, for fear, and then they ignite. The folder on that table wasn't just paper. It was the cost of being too late to say no. And America? America was already watching it burn. They just didn't know where the fire started. Yet, the order came at 0207 Zulu. No preamble, no drills, no testing comms. Just a silent flash across the encrypted display screens inside the hardened war room of Al Udeid Air Base. The words were simple: execute NH-1. Inside Hangar 6, 12 pilots dropped their meals in unison. Some stared at the command line as if it had to be a simulation. But the engines didn't lie. Within minutes, the air trembled with the mechanical thunder of 5-22s, B-2 Spirits, and one Israeli F-35 squadron that officially wasn't there. Unofficially, they had been practicing this route for months. Each target was loaded into the onboard systems already. Natanz, Fordow, Isfahan. 3 pulses, 3 points of no return. The name for the mission, never uttered aloud but marked on every classified dispatch, was Nighthammer. And it wasn't called that because it was surgical. It was called that because it was designed to crush. Inside the refueling room, a young pilot looked at the screen and whispered, "We're not even pretending anymore." Her wingman didn't respond. He was adjusting his oxygen levels. At 38,000 feet above the Gulf, a weapons technician from Kentucky, 25 years old, third tour, turned to his Israeli counterpart and said, "Are we starting World War III from 38,000 feet?" The Israeli looked ahead. "Only if we miss." They didn't miss. From orbit, the assault looked almost cinematic. Lines of red vapor tore through the dark sky like veins of lightning. But on the ground, it was fury. Anti-aircraft sirens screamed across Iran's industrial triangle. Civilians fled, not knowing what was real or rehearsal. But this wasn't theater. This was a strike greenlit from a folder, bypassing congressional oversight, wrapped in the thinnest veil of preemption. And the Pentagon, they were as surprised as everyone else. By the time NORAD confirmed mission underway, the first bunker in Natanz had already gone dark. The irony? Most of these targets were known, but they weren't selected because they were threats. They were selected because they were symbolic, because they'd make headlines. And headlines are weapons when wielded by someone who knows fear is more viral than fact. The reaction online was instantaneous. Yes, the Nighthammer trended globally before dawn broke in Tehran, but not every American was celebrating. In a closed-door session back in D.C., 2 staffers in Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's office stared at the first leaked image, a satellite photo showing a mushroom of smoke where a centrifuge field used to be. AOC didn't flinch. She leaned in. This wasn't an operation. This was a message, written in lives, without permission. Because she had seen this story before. Not in books, in scars. Scars left on districts forgotten after the bombs stopped falling. Scars that look like schools without roofs, veterans without care, flags folded for funerals that never made the news. The war room may have roared in silence, but back home, a new battle was forming. Not in the skies, in the chambers of accountability. While jets returned to base with empty payloads and glowing sensors, a different payload had just been launched, a constitutional one. AOC wasn't looking for retaliation. She was looking for answers. And she knew they wouldn't come from generals. They would come from laws, old, overlooked, and ignored. The kind passed to prevent kings from disguising themselves as commanders. And the only way to bring those laws back to life? A microphone, a chamber, a nation watching. So while the pilots landed and shook hands with men in suits, while TV anchors praised leadership and markets trembled with oil speculation, something quieter was unfolding. A countdown to a different kind of strike, one that wouldn't involve missiles, but moments. One built not on shock and awe, but on shame and truth. Because in the end, power isn't who drops the first bomb. Power is who asks what happens next and doesn't look away. The Situation Room was too quiet for what had just been unleashed. No alarms, no raised voices. Just a cold hum from the screens, where satellite footage showed the aftermath in grayscale. Blackened craters, heat signatures fading, chaos without sound. Around the long oak table, advisors exchanged glances, like they were waiting for someone to blink first. A general finally cleared his throat. "Sir, Congress will ask why." Trump leaned back, smirk barely concealed. "Because they were too slow. And history doesn't reward hesitation. It rewards velocity." A click. A digital pointer circled an area on the map. Natanz, Isfahan, and a third unnamed target. The red glow pulsed around Iran like a wound still bleeding. The president continued, "We moved before the threat became the headline." But the room didn't breathe with certainty, because behind every calculated target was a ripple no algorithm could predict. Iran's retaliation wouldn't be immediate. It would be patient. And in that silence, Washington itself had become the next battleground, not with missiles, but microphones. In another wing of the West Wing, a junior aide slipped a folder onto a policy advisor's desk. Inside, a printed tweet, time-stamped just minutes before the strike. Below it, a single sentence highlighted in red ink. "This violates the War Powers Resolution." The phrase was underlined twice. One of the circles in the Situation Room wasn't just around Natanz. It was around Capitol Hill, and the heat was rising fast. As Trump spun his narrative to the press, preemptive, precise, patriotic. Not everyone was buying the pitch. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was already drafting a speech, her notes scribbled in black pen, annotated with case law. She wasn't preparing for sound bites. She was preparing for something much older than Twitter, a constitutional reckoning. Because while the Situation Room celebrated how many minutes they shaved off the chain of command, AOC was calculating how many rules had been ignored to do it. This wasn't just about Iran. It was about process, about precedent, about power being pulled like a pin from a grenade and thrown into the world stage without even a nod to the people's voice. In a closed intelligence debrief, a security advisor muttered, "If this sets a precedent, we won't need votes to start wars. Just Wi-Fi." Another added, "We didn't just launch missiles. We launched a question, who gets to decide war?" And that question, no matter how many circles Trump drew on maps, had one final destination: the floor of Congress. The cameras would pan. The hearings would begin. But what no one expected, what would send the story viral in less than a heartbeat, was that the fiercest voice wouldn't shout. It would quote, and in that quote, the war story would shift. Not from battlefield to courtroom, but from command to consequence. The Situation Room had planned for missiles. But what it hadn't planned for was what happens when the mic stays on. And someone like AOC walks in, holding the Constitution like a loaded document. The strikes had ended. The real detonation was just beginning. The order didn't come through headlines or press conferences. It came through code. An encrypted whisper from Tel Aviv to 17 agents embedded deep within Iranian soil, agents who had lived undisturbed for nearly half a decade. Operation Lion Reborn, shelved in 2019, now roared back to life, not with tanks, but with shadows. At 2:42 a.m., a message blinked on a secure device buried beneath a false wall in southern Tehran. Awaken. In the heart of a quiet suburb, Yael, one of Israel's most skilled covert operatives, sat at a cafe with an untouched cup of tea. She didn't flinch when the vibration came through her coat. She already knew. Within minutes, she disappeared into the static of Tehran's morning. Her mission was clear: get what they can't rebuild. The message wasn't about bombs. It was about brains. Specifically, the last viable nuclear physicist believed to have access to Iran's third-generation centrifuge models. Not files, not servers. A person, and people, unlike bunkers, bleed. Across Iran, other agents emerged from civilian roles: an antique dealer, a hospital porter, a cleric's driver, all now converging toward a single purpose: disruption from within. The world thought Nighthammer was the blow, but Lion Reborn was the knife slid in after the shout. At the Mossad War Room, analysts watched encrypted feeds. A screen blinked green as Yael bypassed a checkpoint near Fordow, using an outdated security badge that shouldn't have worked, but did. The delay wouldn't be noticed for hours. In Washington, meanwhile, News of the covert reactivation had not reached the public or Congress, but one person had caught a whisper. AOC reading a redacted cable forwarded by a whistleblower who simply signed their message. This wasn't part of the vote, because there was no vote. She read it twice. The briefing contained terms like non-declared allied kinetic escalation, no timestamp, no oversight, no transparency. Invisible war, she whispered under her breath. And that phrase became her new question. Because if a war was being waged without American citizens knowing, without congressional approval, and without clarity on who was pulling the strings, then what exactly was democracy authorizing? At the UN, a ripple moved through the diplomatic circles. Some called it brilliance. Others called it a provocation too clever to trace. But in a schoolyard outside Isfahan, a boy stepped on something shiny, a fragment of a drone's wing, too small to matter until you knew what it meant. The children thought it was a toy. The adults knew it wasn't. And Iran's President Maskian knew his country had just been violated again, not with noise, but with silence. When they strike with stealth, he said to his cabinet, they admit fear. And fear is the only part of war we know better than them. Back in Tel Aviv, the operation was entering its most dangerous phase, exfiltration. But Yael wasn't running yet. She was watching, waiting, memorizing, and transmitting pieces of a design scientists had died to keep secret. Not for money, not even for mission success, but because in war, memory is power, and no vault is more secure than the mind of someone no one suspects. In New York, AOC stood by the window of her office, city lights flickering behind her. She wasn't preparing a speech. She was preparing a reckoning. Because when wars are fought without names, without borders, and without votes, someone must stand up not to fight with weapons, but with the one thing that doesn't require clearance, the truth. And she would make sure that truth wouldn't arrive like a whisper in the dark, but like a bell tolling in daylight. Operation Lion Reborn was underway, but something far louder was about to be reawakened. The question of who truly controls the roar. The sign outside read Mayor Textile Company, but no thread had passed through the gates in over a decade. Beneath the factory's chipped facade and dust-covered looms, Natanz's most guarded secret hummed. Yael stood at the side entrance, heat pressing into her spine through the black uniform she'd borrowed from an unsuspecting night shift guard now unconscious behind a storage rack. One swipe of the ID badge, one silent breath, and she was in. The hallway reeked of metal, chlorine, and fear. Cameras blinked. Automated drones swept past the ceiling rails, and Geiger counters on her belt ticked louder with each step. She passed through 3 biometric gates, each one requiring a micro-time sequence of retinal scan and heartbeat sync. One mistake, and the walls would close. She didn't make mistakes. 2 guards blocked the vault corridor. She paused, whispered a command into her earpiece in Farsi. Noise in Hall 6. A calculated diversion. The men left their post. She moved. Behind the vault's lead-lined walls sat what no sanction could freeze. Documentation of the 3rd phase uranium compression tests, signed off, dated, stamped. But papers weren't enough. She opened the sealed containment unit. A humming, unstable core, glistening in containment fluid, pulsed like a loaded question. Even touching it wrong would mean death not just for her, but for everyone within 50 feet. She didn't flinch. Instead, she used a calibrated capture drone, the size of a matchbox, to scan the isotope ratios. 96.1%. Not commercial, not medical. This was pre-weapon. She uploaded the scan to a silent satellite feed bouncing through 5 continents before reaching a basement in Jerusalem. On the other end, a Mossad handler simply nodded and typed, "Target neutralized. Mission possible." But it wasn't over. Behind her, a low thud echoed. A backup patrol. Too early, not scheduled, not in the plan. Yael slid beneath a conveyor belt, heart slowing to match the rhythm of her breath. One soldier coughed. Another muttered about the radiation sensors glitching again. And then, silence. A chance. She moved through a side shaft, emerging 2 stories above ground through a maintenance tunnel carved into the mountain rock. She didn't stop to celebrate. In operations like these, survival wasn't victory. It was payment due. Back in Washington, a sealed envelope marked Eyes Only Oversight Committee was slid under AOC's office door, by a man who didn't give his name. Inside, a photograph, grainy but clear, of the uranium sample with timestamp overlays from an Israeli comms satellite. It came with no context, no confession, just a message handwritten in black ink. No vote, no chain of command, just ambition. AOC stared at it for a full minute. Then she folded it neatly and placed it next to a copy of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. That article gave Congress, not the president, the sole power to declare war. But what happens when war isn't declared, only acted? When the silence is louder than sirens? Outside Natanz, children played near the old textile fence, unaware that beneath their feet, history had just been stolen. Again. But inside Capitol Hill, something else had begun. Not an uprising, not a protest, a reckoning. AOC called a closed session, not with media, but with memory, with law. Because she understood something few did. Wars don't just start with bombs. Sometimes they start with classified silence. And the only thing that breaks classified silence is a voice unafraid to speak it. And she would. Soon. Loud enough that even those hiding behind black ink and gray suits would have no choice but to answer. Not to her, but to the people they thought would never find out. But they just did, and now they're watching. They won't rebuild anything. Not for 10 years, Netanyahu declared from behind a row of microphones, his voice steady, but his eyes scanning for cracks in the silence. The Israeli Prime Minister's words ricocheted across every major news channel in the region. To the world, it was a bold proclamation of military success. To his staff, it was a gamble sealed with fuel and fire. Inside the war room at Kiryat, aides nodded with cautious approval. The operation had been swift, surgical, and coordinated with just enough deniability. 3 key Iranian facilities had been crippled. Intelligence suggested disruption, confusion, and panic. But within hours, a red folder slid across the polished oak table of Israel's Ministry of Finance. Inside it, a single line item, projected operation cost, $10.2 billion US. The defense minister furrowed his brow. This was not in the vote, he said quietly, nor in the budget. Outside the fortified command centers, the mood was different. In Tel Aviv, protesters filled Rabin Square. What began as a candlelight vigil for peace morphed into a rally of thousands. Banners read, "Hospitals, not warheads," and "My son deserves a future, not fallout." Parents pushed strollers, medics in scrubs chanted for funding. A nurse held up her pay stub next to a photo of the ruined pediatric wing she worked in, abandoned due to lack of funds. "You bought bombs," she screamed, "but not beds." The discontent wasn't just economic, it was generational. The younger Israelis, already disillusioned by years of conflict, saw no glory in another shadow war. They didn't cheer for explosions. They counted the silence between sirens, waiting to see if this time, Tehran would answer. Inside Netanyahu's residence, the walls were quiet, too quiet. An advisor approached with data. Fuel prices climbing, foreign investors jittery, emergency aid from Europe delayed, and the Americans divided. AOC had just delivered a closed-door statement to Congress, demanding an inquiry into the executive chain of coordination between the U.S. and Israel. Her words weren't leaked, but her tone was, "No president should hand a match to an ally without checking who's holding the oil," she reportedly said. Netanyahu stood alone in his office, staring at the windows. Beyond the bulletproof glass, the Israeli flag danced violently in the wind, refusing to settle. The thunder clouds were rolling in, not metaphor, but real. Rain was coming. Or worse. In the distance, a faint light pulsed, an unnatural flash on the horizon. Not lightning, something slower, something man-made. He didn't blink. He had made his choice. History, he believed, would remember him as the man who delayed a nuclear Iran by a decade. But would it also remember the hospitals he closed, the children he ignored, the trust he bartered for explosions? Behind him, a monitor flickered, a satellite feed showing a caravan moving south through Iraq. No insignias, no lights, just movement. The retaliation hadn't begun, not yet, But the pieces were shifting, and for all his speeches, all his calculus, there was one variable he couldn't control: the human cost. And it was rising, louder than cheers, faster than missiles. And this time, it might land in Jerusalem, not Tehran. He stepped onto the podium with no dramatic entrance, no flags whipping theatrically behind him, no anthem swelling in the background, just silence, and a single camera broadcasting live to over 45 million screens across the Middle East. President Maskian didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound a fist. His suit was dark, his tie was ash gray, and his face, lit by the hard white of a bunker's ceiling light, was void of fire, but full of steel. "They think the tiger has fallen," he said, his voice even, deliberate. "But the tiger crouches, to leap." The statement traveled faster than any missile launched 3 nights prior. Not just a threat, it was a reframe, a warning in disguise. Across Tehran, you could feel the tremor, not of fear, but focus. Cafes fell quiet. Markets halted. In the control rooms of Iran's military complexes, shift changes were canceled. Maskian's cabinet didn't argue. They already knew. Operation Zulfiqar, a limited strike retaliatory protocol that had sat untouched since 2021, was activated with 3 signatures and 1 nod. But this time, the response wouldn't come from the sky. It would come from the shadows. Cut to workshops in Shiraz, Mashhad, and Qom, where engineers, mostly under 30, began assembling the weapons that didn't need runways. Drones. Dozens. Then hundreds. Rotors, sensors, GPS overrides, EMP-hardened chips. They worked through the night, under low light, powered by generators whispering instead of speaking. On the walls, a quote from Maskian, handwritten in Persian: "Revenge isn't rage, it's math." Unlike Trump, who posted boasts, Maskian posted nothing. No tweet, no video. Just one sentence on Iran's official state portal: "We will be precise," and that's what made the world nervous. Because when a man screams, you can measure the sound. But when a man whispers with purpose, you can only feel the aftermath. Inside a drone factory tucked beneath a former textile mill in Yazd, a female systems analyst named Fariha calibrated the guidance system of the 4th-generation Quds 9 drone. She hadn't seen her children in 2 days, but her mind was clear. "No schools should be bombed," she had written in a notebook earlier. "But if ours are, I will make sure we aim for silence, not spectacle." Meanwhile, in Washington, analysts scrambled to decipher the pattern. The Pentagon's prediction model showed restraint, but targeted potency. "This won't be a war," one CIA report read. "This will be a chess game with explosives." And in the halls of Congress, a different kind of storm was brewing. AOC, returning from an intelligence briefing, didn't hold a press conference. She simply walked past reporters and left a stack of declassified summaries on the media table. The top page, a Pentagon memo dated 1 year prior, warning that the Isfahan strike would trigger long-term instability if done unilaterally. Her team didn't add commentary. They didn't need to. The memo spoke louder than outrage. Back in Tehran, Maskian sat in a small concrete room with no windows, eyes fixed on a live stream of Israel's airspace. He wasn't watching for targets. He was watching reactions. Delay meant advantage. Overreaction meant justification. When a junior officer rushed in to ask whether they should publicize the drone program's reactivation, Maskian turned slowly and simply said, "Tell them, we've remembered how to count." Then he turned back to the screen and watched. A tiger doesn't roar before it pounces. It waits for the quiet to stretch just long enough to make its move inevitable. And this time, the tiger wasn't just crouching, it was calculating. And somewhere in that stillness, the rest of the world began to realize they hadn't just bombed Iran's buildings, they'd awakened its brain, and now it was thinking. At 3:41 a.m., radar screens lit up across Israel's northern command. First 1 dot, then 10, then dozens. Within minutes, there were over 200, unmanned, silent, relentless. The swarm moved like a shadow over the Mediterranean, veering straight toward the Israeli coastline. In Tel Aviv's defense headquarters, alarms screamed into the concrete silence. A technician whispered the count, 198203, before anyone could ask. The Iron Dome lit up the sky, launching streaks of fire into the air. Civilians watched from rooftops, faces lit by explosions they didn't understand. In Haifa, one father dragged his children into a stairwell while sirens wailed and dogs howled. The Prime Minister's security briefing was cut short. One general simply said, "It's begun." 4 drones made it through. 4, but one was enough. At 4:03 a.m., an industrial complex near Haifa erupted into flame. Glass shattered for blocks. The blast wave knocked out power across half the district. A nearby hospital switched to generators. A camera caught a child with dust in her eyes gripping her mother's hand. The girl asked, trembling, "Is this war?" No one answered. News anchors across the world scrambled for language. Retaliation? Escalation? Declaration? But no term felt adequate. It wasn't a conventional war. Not yet. But it was something else entirely. Maskian, Iran's president, hadn't roared. He had whispered, and 200 drones had obeyed. And still, he hadn't raised his voice. This wasn't Tehran screaming in anger. This was calculus, cold, precise, designed not to flatten cities, but to signal capability and intent. A new language of war, quiet skies, loud messages. At a press conference in Jerusalem, Israeli spokespersons called it an act of aggression, while intelligence briefings showed these weren't just attack drones. Some were data gatherers, some were decoys. The real payload was information and fear. Israel responded with targeted jets into Syrian airspace. No casualties reported, no official admission. But in the war rooms, contingency plans were pulled from dusty drawers labeled Red Scenario Alpha. In Washington, congressional phones didn't stop ringing. Some Republicans praised the boldness of Trump's preemptive strike days earlier. Others whispered about backlash. But one voice, clear, calm, and cutting, emerged on the House floor. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood, holding up the original War Powers resolution. "We are seeing the cost of unapproved war," she said. "A cost paid not in theories, but in lives, in fear, in the voice of a girl asking if her world is ending." Her words weren't just critique. They were a mirror, a reminder that silence doesn't mean safety, and noise doesn't mean leadership. Back in Haifa, rescue workers sifted through the wreckage. Among charred beams and twisted steel, they found a drone casing half melted. Inscribed on it were 3 words in Persian, "This is restraint," and so the world held its breath. Not because of what had happened, but because of what hadn't. Iran hadn't targeted civilians en masse. Israel hadn't struck Tehran in return. The U.S. hadn't deployed full force? Not yet, but every nation knew. The sky was now part of the battlefield. Invisible lines had been crossed, and once drones fly, diplomacy often dies. This wasn't just a night of explosions. It was a lesson. In a world where machines carry messages and children ask questions no adult dares to answer, leadership isn't about reacting louder. It's about thinking deeper. And sometimes the most powerful thing a nation can do is ask what war is before it becomes one. At 2:17 a.m. Moscow time, a courier from Tehran slipped into a back hallway of the Kremlin. No cameras, no convoy, just a diplomatic pouch and the weight of escalation. The message was not a plea, not a cry for help, but a single line typed in Persian and translated twice. "We do not ask for troops, we ask for a shield." In a chamber cloaked in velvet silence, President Vladimir Putin sat beneath a fresco of former Tsars. Around him, a tight ring of advisors leaned in, eyes darting between printed maps, missile trajectory models, and a blinking satellite feed of the Middle East. A long pause filled the room. Then, in his signature measured tone, Putin murmured, "Even shields leave fingerprints." The meaning was clear. Moscow would not march, but it would maneuver. By sunrise, encrypted channels buzzed with confirmation. Russia would issue a public call for restraint at the UN. It would veto any resolution backing an Israeli preemptive strike. It would offer to mediate. Quietly, it would sell Iran radar jamming tech for civilian use. But direct military intervention? Putin knew better. He wasn't saving Iran. He was preserving balance and leverage. Outside, the world speculated. Inside, it was chess, a three-layer game. Iran as a pawn that moved first, Israel as the bishop that countered fast, and America as the king who skipped the board entirely. Russia, the player behind the curtain, moving without touching. Western media scrambled to analyze the shift. Was this Cold War 2.0? Was Russia building a new alliance with Tehran? Would NATO respond? On Twitter, the hashtag #Kremlin Whispers trended globally. But for all the noise, only one quote made headlines. A senior Russian advisor told Reuters off the record, "Stability is not peace, but sometimes it's the closest thing we get." Back in Washington, AOC stepped before reporters, holding a printed copy of the War Powers Resolution in one hand and a quote from President Eisenhower in the other. "No matter how great our might, the rule of law must be greater." She paused, then added, "When missiles fly before Congress speaks, that's not power. That's panic dressed as patriotism." She wasn't just talking to Trump. She was talking to every leader watching, weighing responses in back rooms like the Kremlin's. Her message, deterrence without debate is not defense, it's dictatorship with good branding. And while leaders crafted sound bites, Iran's drone plants worked double shifts. Israel reinforced bunkers in the north, and Russia watched, waited, calculated. Moscow didn't need to fight. It just needed to be asked. But the real drama wasn't in diplomacy. It was in implication. The Kremlin's subtle nod meant this. Any strike now risked a misread by Moscow, a red line not drawn but hinted, a warning not spoken but implied. The media called it fog diplomacy, but the stakes were clear. In a closing shot broadcast on state TV, Putin stood in front of a world map. He didn't point. He didn't name names. He simply said, "Some nations measure strength by fire, others by silence. History remembers both." Final caption on screen, "She didn't carry a sword. She carried the rulebook, and it made more noise than war." Let me know if you'd like this part translated into Vietnamese or adapted into a shorter trailer teaser. At first it was hailed as precision, then as necessity. But as the weeks dragged on and the sirens wailed longer than the headlines did, Israel's citizens began to ask the question their leaders wouldn't dare voice. At what cost? The Ministry of Defense reported that total expenditures across Iron Dome activations, retaliatory air raids, emergency drone deployments, and covert operations had now surpassed $9 billion. The budget hemorrhage was no longer silent. Hospitals announced postponed surgeries, pharmacies rationed insulin, schools canceled after-class programs. At a press conference, the finance minister adjusted his tie and declared, "Temporary taxes for national security." But the word temporary rang hollow in the ears of Tel Aviv's protesters, whose chants grew louder by the hour. Streets once lined with flags now held signs. No missiles, just medicine. A viral photo showed a corner pharmacy with handwritten tape across its entrance. Closed. We heal people, not budgets. Inside the Knesset, tempers rose faster than the deficit. The opposition leaders stood and read a list. 12,000 layoffs in healthcare, 4,000 teachers furloughed, 3 hospitals closed indefinitely. Then came the silence. Not denial, just no reply. Because the numbers had done their own talking. Outside, a single mother shouted into a megaphone, "How many drones is my child worth?" Her voice cracked, not from emotion, but from exhaustion. She had spoken at this square for 4 nights straight. A war being fought in another country was bleeding her kitchen. Meanwhile, foreign investors began pulling capital. The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange dipped. Credit outlooks dimmed. Yet in cabinet meetings, the tone remained defiant. Netanyahu was quoted off record. "History doesn't ask how much victory costs, only whether you paid in full." But the people weren't paying in history. They were paying in hunger, in unfilled prescriptions, in delayed ambulances. At a local news studio, a young anchor broke character and asked her co-host, live on air, "Do you remember when security meant feeling safe, not broke?" Her mic stayed on. So did the echo. That night, a drone crossed back over the border, not with explosives, but with a scrawled banner dropped into a wheat field. What's left to defend when what we're defending is already gone? The camera cut back to the Knesset. A junior lawmaker, once a Netanyahu loyalist, hesitated before speaking, then said it anyway. This isn't security, it's self-harm on a global stage. And with that, the narrative began to crack, not at the front lines, but at the wallet, because missiles may silence enemies. But deficits, they speak louder than war drums ever could. The rotunda felt colder than usual, not because of the marble or the season, but because of what was missing: consent. AOC stood, war powers resolution in one hand, silence in the other. Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. He bypassed us, again. Behind her, an image flickered on the overhead monitor. Missiles in infrared, fired without debate, launched without vote. The chamber rippled. Some ducked. Some whispered. Some stared, frozen. But none could unsee what had already been done. Outside the Capitol, a group of veterans, some in wheelchairs, others leaning on canes, delivered an open letter. Its title was simple: "We fought for oversight, not autocracy." The message thundered louder than any cannon. America's honor wasn't just being challenged abroad, it was being hijacked at home. On Fox News, a guest panelist snarled, "She's grandstanding again." But on social media, the clip of AOC quietly holding up the War Powers Act hit 20 million views in a day. No yelling, no insults, just law. Just the echo of a constitutional question that refused to die. Inside closed GOP briefings, dissent flickered. One Republican congressman, caught on a hot mic, muttered, "This wasn't defense. This was presidential piracy." And suddenly the divide wasn't just between red and blue. It was between those who still believed in checks and those who only checked poll numbers. The White House, meanwhile, released a 42-second video. Trump at a podium. "Swift action saves lives," he declared. "Delay is death." The video cut to flag-draped coffins from a past war. The implication was clear and manipulative. AOC responded not with a press release, but with a classroom. She visited a civics high school in Queens, standing beside a whiteboard where a student had written, "Who declares war?" She tapped the question once, then looked at the camera. If we let that question die, we let democracy die with it. That clip, too, went viral. A former Navy officer tweeted, "I didn't lose a leg for executive ego. I lost it for process, for principle." Within 24 hours, dozens of other veterans added their names. The most unexpected signature came from a Gold Star mother who'd never spoken publicly, until now. Her statement was only 9 words. "The Constitution is not a courtesy call, Mr. President." The political theater turned into a procedural battlefield. AOC introduced a bipartisan motion to censure the unauthorized strike. The vote loomed. Lobbyists panicked. Defense contractors circled like sharks sensing blood. But in the cloakrooms, something shifted. Younger lawmakers whispered about legacy, not loyalty. A junior Republican from Michigan said, "I don't care who launched the missile. I care who gave permission." Meanwhile, outside the Capitol, protest signs multiplied. "Read the War Powers Act. No president is a king. We the people wrote the rules." In the dead of night, someone projected a sentence onto the Lincoln Memorial in blazing light. This was not what he died for. It wasn't just a policy crisis. It had become a moral reckoning. Because when the president treats Congress like a footnote, the people feel like afterthoughts. And when war becomes a press strategy, the Constitution becomes collateral damage. AOC walked the halls alone one morning, passing portraits of past lawmakers. "They argued like hell," she whispered, "but they knew who held the pen." The next morning, in a packed committee room, she opened the session not with anger, but with clarity. "This isn't about left or right," she said. "It's about the right to be asked." And for one long second, even her loudest critics didn't interrupt, because deep down, they knew this fight wasn't hers alone. It was America's. At the UN Security Council, Russia didn't bang the table. It simply submitted a draft, one that called for immediate humanitarian oil exemptions for Iran, citing regional stability and global energy access. The language was soft. The message was not. It was a geopolitical slap masked as a resolution. Within 48 hours, Hungary, Greece, and even France quietly resumed Iranian oil imports, wrapped in paperwork stamped medical supply energy corridor. The barrels moved. So did the message. America could strike, but it couldn't control the ripple. At the Pentagon, aides scrambled to rewrite briefing slides. The plan was to punish Iran, not reposition Europe. Now allies were acting like free agents. A senior diplomat whispered to Politico, "We lit a match without checking the wind." Meanwhile, oil prices spiked. Gas stations from Atlanta to Amsterdam posted signs that felt more like political commentary. $8.29. Freedom ain't free. At a White House press event, Trump stood behind a podium flanked by military brass. "America leads," he said, eyes sharp, jaw locked, whether they like it or not. But the world was watching, and some weren't liking. In Berlin, crowds marched with banners reading, "No more wars for oil." In Istanbul, a pro-Western columnist wrote, "The empire burns its own currency chasing ghosts in the desert." But in Tehran, it was jubilation, broadcast softly but deliberately. An Iranian anchor said, "They tried to choke us, but the pipeline just changed direction." Behind the scenes, shadow diplomacy intensified. China increased orders from Iran through third-party intermediaries. India reopened a back-channel payment system using non-dollar currencies. The sanctions were still in place, on paper. But paper doesn't stop tankers, and tankers don't carry ideology. They carry leverage. In Congress, hearings turned into battlegrounds. AOC held up a leaked memo showing that the State Department had no contingency plan for a sanctions breakdown. "We weren't just unprepared," she said. "We were willfully blind." Conservative media called it grandstanding. But on C-SPAN, the clip trended for one reason. She was reading directly from their own words, and the words were damning. Meanwhile, smaller nations watched the chaos like poker players reading a weak bluff. Brazil announced a review of its military ties with the U.S. Indonesia refused to condemn Iran publicly. The dominoes weren't falling, they were walking away. At a late-night strategy meeting, a National Security Council member reportedly asked, "How did we end up being the ones isolated?" No one answered, because the answer was written in the headlines, in the markets, in the silence of allies who didn't call back. The administration floated a new idea, a secondary sanctions wave against EU banks dealing with Iran. Wall Street groaned. The Chamber of Commerce issued a rare rebuke. One banker tweeted anonymously, "We're not freezing Iran, we're freezing trust." In a moment that would define the week, AOC gave a floor speech that didn't mention Trump's name once. Instead, she said, "Foreign policy isn't a flex. It's a contract with our allies, with our people, with reality. When you break that contract, don't act surprised when no one picks up your call." Some rolled their eyes, others stood and clapped. But the silence afterward, that was real. In Tel Aviv, Israeli newspapers ran dual headlines, one showing Iranian drones, the other showing American stock losses. In both, the subtext was the same. This war was no longer just missiles and maps. It was money, memory, and the myth of control. And in the shadows of the Kremlin, Putin reportedly smiled as the resolution passed with abstentions, not vetoes. He had given no soldiers, just timing, just paperwork, and that was enough to move the world. Because in a globalized order, sometimes all it takes to unravel a superpower's momentum is one quiet vote. No bullets, no speeches, just shadow diplomacy, and the sound of leverage being transferred, barrel by barrel. Israel's prime minister stood behind a row of flags, cameras clicking like metronomes of power. "We have achieved our objective. Iran's nuclear ambitions have been delayed by a decade. Our skies are safer." Applause followed, but so did the doubt. Hours later from Tehran, President Maskian appeared on state television, voice steady, words chosen like bullets. "We remain. We rise. We rewrite." 2 nations, 2 speeches, 2 victories declared. But the world was tired of declarations. CNN aired expert panels, Al Jazeera aired drone footage, RT aired defiance, and TikTok showed a girl. Not a soldier, not a politician. A girl no older than 9 sitting in the dark of Shiraz, placing candles on the ground in the shape of a map. Her mother lit each flame. The caption read, "She said she wanted to see where hope lives." The video had 10 million views by morning, because while nations shouted, people searched. For truth, for meaning, for someone who wasn't trying to win, but simply to witness. In New York, protesters outside the UN held opposing signs. Sanction Iran now, beside Let the Children Sleep. In London, a paper ran with the headline, "Truth Died. Who inherited the microphone?" Meanwhile, in Washington, AOC stood before the Committee on Foreign Affairs and asked, "When both sides say they won, who paid the price?" Her voice didn't shake, her tone didn't rise, but the silence that followed, it echoed like thunder. Some pundits mocked the speech, others clipped it into shorts that lit up YouTube's trending page. In one moment, a veteran whispered off mic, "She's not running for votes, she's running for history." And that's what it had become, a war not just of drones and dollars, but of definitions. Was it defense or provocation? Was Iran resisting or retaliating? Was America leading or losing grip? The narrative was no longer written by generals. It was shaped by images, by voices, by whoever hit record first. In Tel Aviv, a young reservist posted a photo of himself beside a crater. The caption read, "We stopped the bomb. But who stops the bleeding?" The comment section erupted. In Tehran, the regime aired a military parade, except the footage wasn't live. Viewers noticed. And in noticing, they questioned. The battlefront was no longer on land. It was on screens. And in this war, the winner was whoever made the world feel. That's when Reuters published an interview with an Iranian boy named Reza. He had lost his brother in a drone strike, but held no signs of rage. He was building a radio, Reza said, because he wanted to hear the world speak to him. Just one sentence, but it broke through algorithms like a siren, because amid flags and threats and chants and charts, it was the quiet voices, the ones not broadcast, not rehearsed, that held the most weight. AOC shared the story on her page with the caption, "Sometimes power sounds like silence." The post was shared 600,000 times in 24 hours. And still, each government spun its own thread. Israel called it containment. Iran called it resilience. The US called it strategic ambiguity. But to citizens watching from cafes, basements, bedrooms, the question was simple. Who do we believe? In a classroom in Detroit, a teacher paused a news clip and asked, "What's missing here?" A girl raised her hand and said, "The truth isn't in the clip. It's in the pause between words." And that, perhaps, was the revelation, that in a time of noise, the new resistance was listening, not to declarations, but to contradictions, not to speeches, but to silences. And the most powerful narrative wasn't the one declared with fists, it was the one lit by a child's candle, flame by flame, frame by frame. That night, on the UN steps, a journalist from Ghana whispered into her recorder, "The war over might not be the one they meant. It might be the war over meaning." And in the battle for narrative, the world had stopped asking who won. It started asking, who's left telling the story? She didn't raise her voice. She raised the Constitution. On the floor of the House, the lights felt hotter than usual. AOC stood with one hand gripping the lectern, the other holding a single page. Not a speech, a clause. War Powers Act. "He dropped bombs," she said, her voice quiet but unshaken. "I dropped paragraphs." The chamber froze. Some scoffed. But no one looked away. "We are not the audience," she continued. "We are the authors." And yet the pen was ripped from our hand, again. Behind her, a screen displayed a photograph. A soldier in desert camouflage, crouched beside a satellite phone. His eyes looked somewhere between hope and apology. This man called his wife in Queens from Fallujah. He told her, "Tell Maya I'll be home for her birthday. I promise." The chamber remained silent. "That little girl," AOC said, "sat with a party hat on for 3 hours. The cake melted. The gift stayed wrapped. And when the knock finally came, it wasn't him. It was a flag." A gasp broke the silence. Some members wiped their eyes. Others just stared. War is not a metaphor, she declared. It's not a campaign slogan. It's not decisive leadership. It is children asking why balloons are still floating when their dad is not. On the other side of the aisle, some lawmakers shifted uncomfortably. Cameras zoomed, TikTok clips clipped. But she wasn't playing to them. She was speaking to history. If the president wants war, she said, he must ask Congress. Not Twitter, not Truth Social, not a midnight meeting with men who profit from ash. She held up the page again. Just one sentence highlighted. This clause isn't decorative. It's protective. And then, a moment no one expected. A Republican representative, retired military, rose slowly. He didn't interrupt. He simply stood there, eyes locked on hers, and nodded. It wasn't agreement. It was acknowledgement. The kind that said, I may not vote with you, but I hear you. AOC continued. This isn't about party. It's about principle. Because once we normalize unauthorized force, we've surrendered the very check that keeps this republic whole. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. We tell kids to respect rules, yet we let presidents ignore the rule that matters most, the rule that decides who lives, who leaves, who never returns. She took a breath. And if we, the House, sit here and say nothing, then we are not a branch of government. We are a branch office. That line hit like a hammer. Within seconds, it was trending. Number sign branch office. C-SPAN stream crashed. Twitter flooded. Facebook paused moderation to verify it wasn't a deepfake. And still, AOC spoke. Not in outrage, but in grief. This isn't anti-military. It's pro-accountability. I refuse to believe the only way to honor our troops is to keep making more of them. She looked up. You say peace is naive. I say silence is betrayal. A pause. So let the record show. Today, this chamber heard more than noise. It heard a clause. It heard a child's question. It heard a promise broken by distance and delayed by drones. A slow applause began. Not coordinated, not choreographed, just human. It spread like a pulse. Not everyone joined, but enough did to make the sound unmistakable. A shift, a signal. That in the cacophony of missiles and mayhem, a single paragraph had pierced the armor of indifference. And as she walked back to her seat, head high but shoulders heavy, one veteran leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "That wasn't a speech. That was a reckoning." Outside, protesters gathered, some in support, others in fury. But none could deny what had just happened. The room didn't erupt in shouting. It sat in stillness. Because somewhere in between war rooms and warheads, someone reminded Congress what it was built for. Debate, duty, democracy, and above all, decency. The clause still hovered on the screen, bold, simple, binding. Not because it was written in law, but because today it was spoken into memory. It didn't start with a bang. It started with a whisper on CNN of all places. A retired four-star general, once known for his steel will and spotless uniform, now spoke without medals, without fanfare. "We just kicked the hornet's nest," he said, "and now we're surprised the hornets are angry?" The anchor blinked. The studio went quiet. That clip alone would hit 14 million views in 48 hours. But the aftershock wasn't in the broadcast. It was in the shift. Suddenly, America's war drums didn't sound as steady. Because when the generals stop cheering and start questioning, the country listens. Newspapers that once ran strike of strength now ran headlines like, "Who decides war?" On talk radio, a Marine mom said through tears, "My son served twice. He came back with ribbons and nightmares. And now we do this, without even a vote?" In Ohio, a letter landed on the desk of Congress. Handwritten, no return address. Just one line. This isn't safety. This is spectacle. And that word, spectacle, began to haunt the halls of power. In committee briefings, lawmakers whispered it like a curse. Because somewhere between precision airstrikes and perfectly timed press releases, people began to ask, was this defense or was it theater? AOC returned to the chamber. She didn't gloat. She didn't shout. She simply held up a folder labeled OCO, Overseas Contingency Operations. This, she said, is the budget line where accountability goes to die. She flipped through it. $132 billion, buried under acronyms. Every dollar has a story, and some of those stories end with folded flags. A pause. The president says this isn't war, just a limited response. But when you bury sons, it doesn't feel limited. It feels final. The cameras rolled. A congressman from Kentucky tried to interrupt. She didn't flinch. "If you want to debate me," she said, "start by reading the document you keep voting to extend." Social media ignited again. Not in chaos, in clarity. Veterans posted photos of empty boots and missing friends. Teachers asked students to define the War Powers Resolution. One high school girl in Tucson wore a shirt that said, "Democracy has a paper trail. Show yours." Meanwhile, the international press flipped tone. France 24 ran the headline, "The General Speaks and America Listens." Al Jazeera aired a special titled, "From Strike to Scrutiny." And inside the Pentagon, aides admitted something quietly. Something that hadn't happened in years. Civilians were asking real questions, not about missiles, but about motive. And in the quiet before the next vote, a second general, this time from the Navy, sent an email to 3 senators. Not classified, not coded, just typed. "You don't win trust with shockwaves. You earn it in the silence that follows." AOC printed it. She read it aloud on the House floor. "You don't win trust with shockwaves. You earn it in the silence that follows." The room didn't erupt. It absorbed, because something had shifted. The chaos hadn't disappeared. But for the first time, it had to compete with conscience. Across the country, candlelight vigils appeared in unlikely places. Truck stops, courthouses, even football fields. Not protests, just presence. People standing still in a country that rarely pauses. And on one of those nights, a group of veterans in Boston lit 11 candles, each for a name never printed in headlines. One of them whispered, "We served so you could speak." Someone else replied, "Now it's her turn to speak for us." That clip made it to AOC's office. She watched it alone. No staff, no camera. Just silence, flickering light, and a reminder. Not all wars are fought with weapons. Some are fought with memory, with law, with lines drawn not on maps but on principle. That night she wrote 5 words on a sticky note and taped it above her desk. Not all bombs explode outward. And with that, the next chapter began. Not with volume, but with vision. The room is silent, too silent for a world at war. A single light hums above, flickering occasionally as if unsure it should still be on. Beneath it sits a girl, barely 17, sleeves rolled, pencil in hand, her eyes locked on a graphite-stained notebook. Not a missile, not a map, but a reactor diagram, hand-drawn, precise. She doesn't flinch when distant rumbles echo above ground. Instead, she whispers to herself, "They thought they ended something, but she just began." Her name is Lala. No one in the West knows it. Not yet. But in this makeshift lab carved beneath the hills of northern Iran, she's sketching what no strike could erase, a vision of clean energy, built not for warheads but for water pumps. Not to scorch earth, but to cool it. Outside, the world debates sanctions and sovereignty. Inside, she calculates radiation shielding for a solar-powered thorium cycle. She doesn't dream of bombs. She dreams of villages with lights that never flicker, clinics that don't ration refrigeration, and schools that run science classes with real equipment. One wall of her lab is covered in newspaper clippings, some charred, some smuggled. She's cut out every line that mentioned destruction, but circled the names of scientists who spoke of peace. One photo shows a U.S. Congresswoman, AOC, holding up a clause. Beneath it, Lale wrote, "Paragraphs over payloads." A tremor shakes the ceiling. Dust falls. She wipes her notebook clean and mutters, "If they break one lab, we build 2 more. Across the ocean, politicians argue on primetime. A retired general warns, "If you kill potential, you only scatter it." Somewhere in Texas, a professor pauses his lecture. "You know," he tells his class, "the best reactor design I've seen this year came from a girl in Iran, Unofficially, of course. The students blink. He doesn't elaborate. He doesn't need to. In Washington, AOC enters her office. A stack of letters awaits, most angry, some afraid. But one, folded neatly and unsigned, holds a drawing. It's the same reactor Lala designed, only this version has wind turbines beside it, and a school. At the bottom, 5 words. They thought she would stop. AOC pins it to her wall. No return address, no politics. Just the line of a girl too young to vote, too stubborn to surrender. Back in the lab, Lala plugs in a small battery. A flicker, a click. Then the low hum of a fan, powered not by uranium, not by conflict, but by a hydrogen cell made from scrap parts and hope. She smiles, not because it's perfect, but because it works. For one room in one night, under one broken sky, that is enough. They thought they ended something, she whispers again. But she just began. The phrase becomes a chant. It spreads on Farsi forums, then Arabic blogs, then a Reddit thread titled numbered Daughters of the Atom. Soon it's on stickers in Paris, murals in Manila, hashtags in Detroit. One day it appears as graffiti across a bombed wall near Haifa, in Hebrew, in English, in silence. Somewhere someone records a piano version of the phrase. 12 notes, minor key, rising tension. It becomes the background track of a viral TikTok where teens read clauses from the War Powers Act in 10 different languages. One comment reads, "Paragraphs over payloads." Remember that. Back in the chamber, AOC prepares her closing remarks. Cameras everywhere, pressure mounting, but her voice is steady. "I know many of you fear Iran's centrifuges," she begins, "but you should fear something more powerful. A girl with a notebook, a question, and nothing left to lose." She holds up the drawing again. "She didn't build a bomb. She built a future. Can we say the same?" A pause. A breath. The room waits. "They thought they ended something," she finishes, "but she just began." The gallery goes still. Outside, protesters lower their signs, not in defeat, but in reflection. Inside, a janitor stops sweeping to listen, not because she's loud, but because she's right. And somewhere in a lab without a ceiling, a girl adjusts a dial and begins again. The marble floors echo beneath her boots as AOC walks alone. No cameras now, just footsteps and the low murmur of a nation catching its breath. The hearing is over, but the ripple isn't. She rounds a corner and stops, quietly. A boy, no older than 10, sits on a hallway bench, his backpack half-zipped, an iPad glowing in his lap. On the screen, her speech plays again, word for word, paragraph by paragraph. He's mouthing along, not the way kids repeat lyrics, but like someone trying to memorize a spell that just might fix something. She doesn't interrupt, just watches. For a second, the noise of war, of critics, of chaos, fades. Then comes a voice behind her. Firm measured, a Republican congressman, not a firebrand, a lifer, one of the old guard. "We didn't agree," he says, extending his hand, "but you made me think." She looks him in the eye, no smirk, no fight, just presence. She shakes his hand, not for him, for the moment, for the message, for the boy watching who now knows disagreement doesn't have to mean disconnection. As the congressman walks away, he passes the boy and glances at the screen. Doesn't say a word, but he slows. Just enough. AOC steps outside. Reporters rush. Microphones stretch. But she doesn't stop, doesn't speak, just raises one hand, like punctuation. Because the point was already made, not in shouts, not in votes, but in a pause, a handshake, a child repeating the line that might just outlive the headlines, a line that didn't need a bomb to be remembered. It only needed truth, spoken once, with no apology. And in that silence, America listened. It aired quietly, no music, no countdown, just the anchor's voice, steady and unhurried, as if even urgency had finally exhaled. Tehran reports partial restoration of electricity, no new military strikes. UN resolution 4,983 passes, prohibiting unilateral airstrikes by any nation without assembly approval. Behind him, a muted map of the Middle East faded into white. No arrows, no red zones, just borders, intact. Then came the footage. Workers in Tehran reconnecting wires in silence. A reactor's gate closing with a clank. A child flipping a light switch, then clapping when it worked. In Tel Aviv, an empty bomb shelter, now used as a study group room. And in Washington, a floor speech printed on thick cream paper, now framed in the Library of Congress. The camera lingered on it, no voiceover, just one caption below. She didn't fire a missile. She read a clause. The screen shifted once more. A final line spoken softly, not as judgment, but as a mirror. Some used weapons. Others used words. But only one kind stays printed in history. Then, fade to black. No theme music. No applause. Just the echo of truth. And the weight of silence finally meaning peace. When bombs stopped falling and the lights came back on, it wasn't a missile that made history. It was a voice, a clause, a truth too powerful to ignore. This story reminds me that silence isn't peace, and speaking softly doesn't mean speaking weakly. In a world obsessed with force, it was restraint and clarity that changed the tide. I ask myself, when I'm faced with chaos, do I react loud or do I respond right? What about you? Do you believe words still have the power to rewrite the future? She didn't start a war, she stopped the world to listen. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.